I think of playwriting as a bit like a funnel effect. You have all the ideas, you narrow them down, and then they kind of go through this tube for a fairly short period of time and get spat out at the other end, and there's your play. Whereas the book, it was like running a marathon. Instead of running 100 meters, it was running a marathon. And that required a completely different discipline that I had to learn while I was doing it.
Hello and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Sonia Faleiro, and today I'm delighted to be in conversation with Paul Dodgson, a person of many, many skills. Paul is a writer, musician, and teacher. He's been in the writing room for the soap opera EastEnders. He created plays for children, and he's written the lyrics and music for the Nutcracker at the Bath Theatre Royal. His career is varied and so very interesting, which is why I'm really happy to be in conversation with him today. Hi, Paul.
Hello, it's lovely to be here.
How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I'm very good.
Great. So, Paul, February 7th is celebrated as Charles Dickens' birthday. Many of us who love his books have a favorite. Mine is Oliver Twist, the story of an orphan's search for belonging among a band of young pickpockets in 1830s London. The story, as you know, has unforgettable characters like the orphan Oliver, the criminal Fagin, who leads the band of thieves, and that sociopath, Bill Sikes. And of course, such great lines like, "Please, sir, I want some more," and "Some people are nobody's enemies but their own," you know? So, to kick things off, Paul, is there a particular Dickens novel you'd like to recommend for our listeners?
Well, I keep coming back to A Christmas Carol, actually. Perhaps not a novella rather than a novel, or even a long short story. But I think it is wonderful, and I think that it is as relevant now as it was when it was written. I've got a sort of long relationship with it. I've been in it, as an actor. I've read it as an audiobook, and I've listened to it as an audiobook as well as read it. And I'm still surprised by the prose, and I'm still surprised by the ideas in it. And I suppose also I'm interested in the London that is evoked in the book, because my cousin did some research on our family history and discovered that there's a point in our family history where our family lived in a part of the East End, which is almost off the map of those days. And I think it's the bit in A Christmas Carol when Scrooge, after he's died, his possessions are this is in the Ghost of Christmas Future section of the book, where he hasn't actually died, but they project into the future. He watches his possessions being hawked in a part of London where I think Dickens says nobody ever goes, apart from kind of criminals and things. I think that's where my kind of ancestors come from. So it feels very personal as well.
I love that. Tell me, what do you think makes Dickens so enduring?
Well, I think he has a grasp on humanity that is universal. Mm-hmm. And I think you see that in A Christmas Carol, and you see that in the gap between rich and poor, and the kind of commentary on poverty. And as I say, I think it's as relevant now as it was then. Perhaps there are some people these days who struggle with the length of the novels and possibly even the length of the sentences. But I think they're, having read them all out loud, having read A Christmas Carol out loud for an audiobook once, I can tell you that they're perfectly weighted and constructed. So I think it's a combination of all those things. But I think ultimately it is the way in which he understands human behavior and humanity.
Yeah, I think you're right. And also he's so profoundly empathetic. Were there, and I ask you this as somebody who was born and grew up in India and didn't read Dickens until much later, were there a lot of writers of that time that you read when you were growing up, who spoke so deeply and so vividly about inequality?
No, not really. I mean, I suppose the other writer that I was kind of captured by about the same time was Thomas Hardy.
Yeah.
And perhaps something similar is going on in a rural setting there, and that's interesting. But perhaps not to the same extent that kind of visceral detail of city life that you get from Dickens.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because I say this as somebody who adores London. I've been here for 10 years. It is a grimy city. It has so many layers. There's a lot going on. And I think this is true of many parts of the country, and yet we don't see that on the page. But I'm now reminded of a terrific novel by Nikita Lalwani, who was longlisted for the Booker Prize for Gifted, which is a classic. She wrote a book called You People, which was unfortunately released just when the pandemic struck us all down. And it is set in a restaurant in a corner of London that is run by immigrants who escaped the civil war in Sri Lanka. And it shows you about the incredible challenges and the incredible efforts that people make to come to London because they see this city as a beacon, and how they survive and how they become a part of society and make do without being recognized as a part of society. So I feel like there are things in common between Nikita's work and some of the work that we've been reading, sort of draws inspiration from Dickens's very visceral view and sort of description of the world around him.
Yeah, I'll have. That sounds fascinating. I've added that to my reading list already.
Well, on that note, we are going to dive into the Royal Literary Fund Writers' Archive, which has been created over the last 10 years, and it's got hundreds of writers talking about their experience of the writing life. In the first clip that we are going to hear during this episode, we hear from Courtier Newland, who reflects on his 20-year writing career. Let's have a listen.
I've been a writer for about 20 years, and in that time, certain aspects of the job have changed very little. In the beginning, I didn't know what I was doing most of the time, and so the only thing within my control was the process. I'd get up very early in the morning. I'd like to say about 8, but in truth it was probably more like 9. I'd eat a very small breakfast and have a cup of tea before I set to work for the day. In those days, I was pretty relentless. It was 4 to 5 hours straight work with little or no breaks until I felt like stopping. Then I'd call it quits. That went well enough until I tore a ligament in my knee when I jumped up to answer the phone. After that, I took regular 15-minute breaks every hour and only worked 3 hours at the recommendation of my orthopedic therapist. After that, I went out of the house, did my admin, or worked on rewrites. Nowadays, I very much stick to the same routine. It's mostly what I do with my free time that has changed. The first was going off to do workshops or readings and other things that promoted the novels I've written. When that dried up, I found myself at a bit of a loss. What was I supposed to do with my time now? I began to move into different aspects of research, going to the library, talking to people who might help me write the next story, or the one after that. Sometimes it means going to the cinema, or watching television, or a documentary, which all counts towards the writing time. One thing I've learned is it's writing, just in a different form. And more often than not, the writing never stops. It's quite normal for me to be having a conversation or bathing my 3-year-old daughter, only to be hit with an idea. So I've got used to carrying my phone and my notebook with me, and I usually have my computer. The days of writing things down on a coffee shop napkin are well behind me. Much of the writing life involves meetings or travelling or staying in hotels. When I started, I thought I'd be holed up in a room somewhere, not running from place to place in a lifestyle that sounds more glamorous than it actually is. I'm not complaining at all, because I love the constant change this life brings, but it's definitely nowhere near Hollywood. In those moments, near to home or further afield, it's the process that brings things back to order. Wherever I am, it's always a comfort to open the laptop, look at the work, and get back to the thing that started it all, the writing. I'm not sure how many jobs are this all-consuming, but I do know that there's nothing I'd find as satisfying.
I love the idea of writing in a different form. So I write nonfiction, and it's focused around a lot of groundwork, a lot of reportage, which I really enjoy. But a lot of that ends up being more than interviewing people or traveling. It's about watching films or reading poetry or listening to music or sometimes just immersing myself in the culture. It's basically about immersing myself in a world. And sometimes immersing yourself in a world is not just writing or reading. So I guess the question for you is, what does your non-writing writing time look like?
Well, as I heard that, and I heard this is writing in a different form, I sort of said yes to myself inside, because I agree with that so much. I don't think I've heard it framed quite as well as that before, because I think I always feel a little bit guilty if I go and see a film in the afternoon. And actually, that can be really helpful. Going for a walk can be really helpful. I think I have an idea which goes back to possibly being at school and doing homework, that being chained to my desk is somehow work, and that anything else is peripheral and a little bit silly and isn't actually productive. And so I love to hear that expressed, that actually it's okay to do other things, because I do recognise how important that is. And I suppose my non-writing time is spent doing lots of different things. I mean, I play the guitar. I'll often go downstairs and in the middle of writing something, and I'll sing a song in the kitchen.
So good.
That will often happen.
Yeah.
I'll go for a walk around the park. I try not to sort of interact too much with people when I'm working on things, because I find that gets a bit distracting during the writing time. I mean, when I have a deadline coming up, there's undoubtedly a period of time where I focus on writing every day for a certain amount of time, and then I stop. And I probably then at times like that sort of limit the input that I'm having from other things, because, I find there are some books I read that will influence what I'm writing too much.
Yeah, I hear you.
And so I'm sort of careful about that. But the rest of the time, I do like to kind of take things in from all over the place. I like to watch films. I like to go for walks. I enjoy working in lots of different ways that is related to writing. And I find all of that kind of feeds back to writing itself.
I feel like I need to maintain my equilibrium while I'm in the writing zone. So if I'm deep into a manuscript, I can take a break to walk my dog in the park, and that does not disturb my equilibrium. It doesn't make me feel too happy, or doesn't introduce any sadness or any rupture. I am as I am. But then I don't want to go out and meet people, just like you say, because that kind of changes the world in which you are in, which is good in one way, but maybe not for that writing time that you're trying to maintain. So I think it really is interesting. It comes down to a matter of understanding yourself, what works for you as a writer, and what helps you maintain your momentum. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is quite important to distinguish between those times. A lot of what I've written over the years has been written in quite short bursts. Even a sort of fairly long play is perhaps about 10,000 words. So that's only sort of an eighth of the size of a book. So I can isolate myself away for those sort of periods of time. But when I wrote my memoir, which was the first book I'd written in that came out in 2019. That was a different story, because I worked out I was going to need to write for 70 days to write the first draft.
So that's very organised of you.
I plotted ahead because things kept getting put into the diary. And so I knew I needed to carve out 70 days before the deadline. And so that was really interesting, because I couldn't work in the same way, because I think of playwriting as a bit like a funnel effect. You have all the ideas, you narrow them down, and then they kind of go through this tube for a fairly short period of time and get spat out at the other end, and there's your play. Whereas the book, it was like running a marathon. Instead of running 100 meters, it was running a marathon. And that required a completely different discipline that I had to learn while I was doing it.
That is so interesting. So you have a 10,000 word play.
Yeah.
You have a memoir.
Yeah.
You also write lyrics.
Yeah.
What kind of energy do these different forms of writing require of you, and what kind of time do they take?
Well, songwriting is interesting because I think it sort of happens, and I don't ever say, today I'm going to write a song. I used to. I used to work in theatre, writing music and lyrics, as you mentioned earlier on. And on those days, I would say, today I have to write a song. I have 10 songs to write, and I have to write one song today. And what I would do is usually go to a cafe, sit in a cafe, often where there was music on in the background that I couldn't quite hear. And I would start to imagine that I could hear it. And I would start to imagine a sort of melody, which often gave me a kind of lyrical pattern, then like a template. And I could start to write lyrics around that. And then I would wait till I had enough lyrics before I left the cafe. Then I'd go home and I'd try and write the music straight away before the whole idea disappeared. And I'd sort of have to do that day after day after day, usually to meet the deadlines. Once I started writing songs for myself, that I'd be, the songs that would be on records that I would release, that's a different process. I find they just come. So that's a really interesting experience, that I won't have a song one day, and then I will pick up the guitar, and there'll usually be the nugget of an idea that then demands that it's fully researched and expressed. Usually within about 2 or 3 days, there's a song.
So good.
And it's amazing.
So good.
Whereas
you make it sound very easy.
Well, it's fascinating the way it happens. But whereas I find a play is a more conscious process of having to work, having to sit down. And the book that I wrote, that was a different thing altogether. That was required more planning, much more discipline over a longer period of time.
And writing music and writing a memoir, they seem to be very personal things. Is that correct? Or does memoir require much more introspection, much more honesty, greater courage perhaps?
I think, it certainly requires introspection, yeah. I mean, I love the memoir form. I got interested in it because just over 20 years ago now, my father died. He actually lived on the Kent coast, but he ended up in hospital at the Charing Cross Hospital, which looked out over the city of London. And he was in a ward there, and he suddenly started telling me stories about his life that I didn't know anything about. And he told me that he was an engineer, and he told me that he'd worked for a Norwegian entrepreneur after the war and designed a fabric printing press, which they thought would revolutionize the clothing industry, but never actually quite worked. Oh. And it was incredible. And I knew nothing about this. And as he told me, we were looking out across London, and he told me where his office was and where the workshop was. And he kind of described the city as it was in its post-war state, full of bomb sites and smog. And it was incredible to sort of experience that side of him that I knew nothing about. And he didn't write anything down. And so when he died, all of those stories went. And I think that's why I got interested in memoir writing, and why I then started to think about how people write their stories down and the different techniques that they use in order to do that. And so, yes, it is introspective, but I think it's a wonderful thing to do, to use the experience that we have every day and write it down.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Paul.
Are you a professional writer, a novelist, poet, translator, or playwright? Imagine using your skills to support students in higher education while also supplementing your income. The Royal Literary Fund Fellowship is now accepting applications, and we're searching for dedicated professional writers like you to join us at over 80 universities and colleges across the UK. Share your writing and editing skills with students at every level across a variety of subjects, from art to engineering, from nursing to law. Become an RLF Fellow, and you'll have the opportunity to make a real difference in the lives of others while earning £16,000 a year for part-time work. Visit rlf.org.uk to check your eligibility and apply today. The Royal Literary Fund. We believe writers matter because writing matters.
Let's move on to our craft question. Now, you work extensively with new writers as an executive producer on the BBC's new creative scheme. Can you talk a little bit about your process when mentoring new talent?
Over the last few years, I've worked with a lot of writers on new radio drama. And these are writers who've never written for radio before, some who haven't written before. I try to let them express themselves first and then talk about what's going on in the writing and how it might work for radio and how it might not work for radio. Rather than sort of hectoring and lecturing, I like to kind of let people express themselves and then work with that to develop the idea until we get to its sort of finished form.
Are there certain qualities that emerging writers tend to have in common?
Well, some writers instinctively understand the medium that they're working with, and they do very well. Others need more work, but then get it later on. So I don't like to sort of think that there are some that are better than others, because I know I was a kind of late developer in many things, and still it takes me a while to kind of get things. So I recognize that in other people. So I suppose that's how I'd answer that question, and say some people take longer to get there than others.
Yeah. I have to agree with you. So I run a mentorship program for emerging writers in South Asia. So India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. And it's called South Asia Speaks, and it's been running now for nearly 5 years. And every year we have an open call for writers. And when a writer gets through the process, which is essentially submitting a sample of their writing, we put them in touch with an established major author, and that author workshops their writing for a year. And our fellows also have access to craft workshops and to masterclasses, and it's all for free, because the idea is that somebody who has the talent and who is willing to work hard should not have to then struggle to pay for that training, which is much more accessible in other parts of the world, particularly, in the West. But I have, over these past few years, been able to figure out, put a finger on the kind of person who I think is going to last the distance. And usually it is the one who works just very quietly on their book, and I don't know why some writers are able to do that at an earlier age than others, but really, if somebody understands that in order to write a book, you have to write a book, there is really no other way around it, then they're just able to write a book and reach the end, faster than anybody else. And by fast, I mean it could still be 4 or 5 years, of course. So I've also seen writers, emerging writers, who have not been able to make it for various reasons, and life sometimes also gets in the way. But on that note, have you seen common pitfalls that writers tend to sort of trip into?
With radio writing, one of the common pitfalls is to become so invested in the play that's being written that you start to hear it and you start to imagine that you know best about how it can be then produced and realized and indeed rewritten. Whereas I think perhaps the message I try to pass on is that it's a process of collaboration, and that perhaps unlike other forms, you need to sort of let go and let somebody else realize the work, and that your job is to kind of write the script, and then you let that script go, and to sort of believe when somebody says this isn't working because, and often there are very good reasons why a script doesn't work. Sometimes it can be because there's a problem with the mechanics of the story, or an assumption that certain things are clearly understood when they haven't actually been set up in the first place. Sometimes there's need for foreshadowing of events, because otherwise they occur suddenly out of nowhere, and it kind of throws the audience off kilter, that sort of thing. So I think it's being able to listen to the feedback that you're getting and apply it to your own work. Not necessarily agree with it all and put up a defense where it's necessary.
I think that's really good advice. I mean, I've written a few books and I should also take that advice. I think we should all be very open to taking feedback from people that we respect and trust, certainly. Let's move on to our second clip. We are now going to listen to the writer Julia Crouch, who is a city dweller by choice and finds inspiration in human interactions. Though she occasionally thinks about quiet rural settings, Julia admits she would find them dull. Let's have a listen.
Although I grew up in a village, I have lived in cities all my adult life. First in central Bristol and now Brighton. Occasionally, I have entertained fantasies about waking up to green fields, silence but for birdsong, and a day stretching ahead composed of nothing but communing with words and nature. But oh my God, I'd be bored out of my mind. Like many writers, I welcome the long stretches of my own company that my job entails. I'd go so far as to say that if I don't get them, I get really antsy. But, as well as committing words to paper or screen, our craft is based on our ability to observe and interpret the actions of human beings in the environments they inhabit. In other words, we need to get out there. It's our field study. I live in a terraced house, and I cannot help but know my neighbours and what they get up to. The evidence seeps through the walls and over the fence. I'm right in the centre of town, so whenever I'm done at my desk, I can walk through the city or to the seafront. I'm within easy reach of cafes, restaurants, pubs, cinemas, bookshops, corner shops, theatres, libraries, and, until recently, I could indulge my favourite pastimes of flaneuring, eavesdropping, nosy parkering, and extrapolating situations into worst-case scenarios, the stock in trade of my particular brand of fiction. Now we are in lockdown, though, and the city has become a very different place. There's no hanging about with a coffee and earwigging, no note-taking of angry phone calls on the bus, no sneaking off for crafty matinees at the Duke of York's, our local independent cinema, with striped stockinged legs waving from its roof. And indeed, at the moment, we often wake to nothing but birdsong, which is actually rather lovely. But my afternoon exercise walk still brings material that I can magpie away for the future. Just yesterday, I spent some time observing the different natures of the queues outside supermarkets, from Kemp Town Morrison's to London Road Aldi, to HISBE, an acronym for How It Should Be, a peak Brighton, minimal waste, locally sourced produce supermarket. I also watched, perhaps rather too closely, a scene between a group of street drinkers on Brighton's level and the police, who were telling them to disperse. And then, on the way home, I sympathised with a poor parent trying to explain to a wailing toddler that the Queen's Park playground is out of bounds at the moment. It all goes down in the notebook and will one day surface as something or other, although I am telling myself very firmly that I am not going to write a dystopian lockdown novel. You are really not, Julia. Yes, nature is important, and I love nothing more than to spend time out in the wilds. I should right now be on holiday in an off-grid cottage on the Donegal coast. In fact, my writing is often about a close observation of the natural world, but unless you people it with characters rubbing up against each other, then what's the point, really? No, lockdown or not, give me the city in all its messy glory.
Such a great piece from Julia Crouch.
Yes.
I love the Writer's Archive. And speaking of, you have a piece in the Writer's Archive that I read recently and absolutely loved. You write about moving from Bristol, where you lived for a couple of decades, to Cardiff.
Yes.
And what your experience was like during the lockdown and how it influenced you to learn Welsh. And it made me think about how places change who we are, the direction that we're going in, and therefore, as we are writers, inevitably influence how we write, or perhaps what we write. Would you talk about that?
Yes, of course. So I moved to Cardiff in 2017 from Bristol. As you said, I'd lived in Bristol for a long time. And one of the interesting things about Bristol is that it's only 25 miles as the crow flies from Cardiff. And I had no appreciation of the fact that there was another mother tongue that existed so close, and that's Welsh. And when I got to Wales, I discovered that my neighbours spoke Welsh as the first language in their home. They're bilingual, actually they're trilingual, so that as soon as they saw me they would speak English, but nevertheless Welsh was the language of the house. And then I realised that more and more people around me were speaking Welsh, and I realised the role that the language has in Welsh society and how important it is to the place in which I was now living. And so I decided I wanted to learn it, which I've been doing. I started in 2022, after lockdown, having been influenced by hearing much more of the language being spoken during lockdown all around me. And I think what's the most interesting thing about it is the way it's changed my perception of English, or Saesneg as it's called in Welsh. I was monolingual before. And I mean, I grew up in Kent within sight of the French coast, which you would think would be inspiration enough to actually learn to speak French, because you could just hop across the channel and then you've got a whole other country to kind of play in linguistically. But no, it didn't happen. So it's been an uphill struggle, but it makes me realize what a complicated thing language is. And as I'm speaking to you now, I'm unconsciously kind of pulling structures of words together one after another and doing a kind of dance with them. And then when you're deprived of that in another language, it's intensely frustrating, but it's also really interesting and changes your relationship with your own language. So, you know, I absolutely love learning Welsh. In fact, I will often go to bed at night and read a book in Welsh now rather than in English. And what's really interesting about that is they're fairly simple books, kind of books, you know, maybe a teen might read if they were learning English. And what happens is I read very slowly, but I inhabit the world much more. So when I read in English, you know, I might read sort of 10 pages very quickly and I'll skim across it. Whereas when I read in Welsh, I inhabit the scene that's being described so intensely. I can sort of see it vividly, and it stays with me. So just last night, I was reading a Welsh book in which a guy goes out and he breaks up with his girlfriend. His girlfriend tells him she's met somebody else, and then he goes home, and then he discovers his estranged father is sitting on the sofa. And so he goes to the beach and he sits in the rain and looks at the sea in Llandudno. Now, this all happens within a fairly short chapter in the book. And I read it, and then I had to stop because I'm quite slow reading still. But the vividness of this scene is incredible. And it's almost like watching a film. I can replay this small sequence of events in my head. And I think that's whereas in English, I'll tend to race through, particularly prose, because I'm sort of always hungry to kind of move on. So it's changed my relationship with reading as well.
That's fascinating. It's sort of drawn you in and made you really savor the language and the story?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, not necessarily knowing every word, but my brain having to make the connections and understand what I can't read, you know, rather than reaching for the dictionary, trying to sort of intuitively discover what it is that's being said.
We are now going to move on to the technical slot of this episode. And this is where I'm going to ask you for some advice, because you've got extensive background in media as a radio producer at the BBC. You've produced hundreds of programs and, of course, work closely with writers, both emerging and established. So writers today get asked to make a lot of appearances, talk on radio, TV sometimes, festivals. And it's a tricky thing for writers because one of the things that gives us a sense of security is not being out there. So how do we work on this? How do we get comfortable with talking to large groups of people, speaking to a mic, doing all of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is important to be able to communicate with people. I think increasingly in the world, it's important to be able to communicate the ideas behind your writing to other people in settings other than the book or the play or the screenplay. And whether that's in a university setting when you're talking to students or at a festival. When I first started writing and I started having to appear in front of people, I think I felt that I needed to script every single thing that I said. Mm-hmm. And, if I was doing a 4-hour lecture in a university, I would think, this is going to take a long time because I need to write every word down. And then I realized that I didn't, but I needed to think through what I might be asked and what I might say. And I think that helped. I think, so that sort of preparation helps. I think practice helps, So
that's a good tip. So reading what you've written or what you might want to say.
Yeah, I think if you're going to, just as you would if you're writing something, reading it out loud is good to see how it sounds like. Practice is good. So, I think taking every opportunity to talk to people and to speak is a good thing. I think we probably do that anyway, don't we? We tend to say yes to everything.
Right, this is true. Guilty.
I know, I do. So you get the practice, but when I work with writers, perhaps who are self-publishing, one of the things I've noticed is they're quite good at sort of pushing themselves to talk to people and to take the opportunity to practice. And I think to reflect on the way it's gone, and to learn from what you've done is useful. So, you prepare, you think what you might be asked as far as you possibly can. You don't necessarily rehearse every single word, but you certainly speak out loud. You do the event, and then afterwards you reflect on what's happened, and you think maybe, what went right and what didn't go so well there, and what can I learn from that in the future?
That's brilliant. So prep, practice, and reflect.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I may have one more based on my own experience talking to audiences, which is for the writer to remember that the audiences are there for them, that audiences are forgiving. It doesn't matter if you fumble a question or you mangle your thoughts or you trip over a stair while climbing up to the stage. Audiences are there for you because they enjoy your work and they want to hear you talk.
Absolutely.
It's okay to make mistakes, just as you might in a conversation.
Well, absolutely. Yeah? Yes. It's interesting that because the fear of mistakes is something that I think is quite common. And it really doesn't matter. When I used to work at the BBC as a producer, and I was once asked to chair a discussion, and it was during a time when there were big cuts happening in the BBC, and I had to work with a group of people, find their differing opinions, and then report back to a large assembly. And the people just argued amongst themselves, and I didn't have a single thought. I didn't really understand the question I'd been asked in the first place. And then when I stood up to report back, I fumbled, and the guy who was chairing it said, "Oh God, somebody help him out, will they?" And I sort of sat down and somebody else stood up. It kind of stopped me speaking for ages and ages and ages. And then I think when I left the BBC and I started being asked to speak again, I say to begin with, I thought I had to script everything, but then I discovered, no, it's okay just to talk. And then I think the other thing that I began to realize was I do know about this, I spend all day doing this. I spend all day writing and thinking about writing and working with writers. So I do know about this now. I've been doing it for a long time. And so, I have got something to say. So it's okay to, I'm not an imposter. It's okay. I've got something to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's very important to keep in mind, I think. Thank you so much, Paul. I'm going to now hand over the mic to Anne Morgan, who's got the latest RLF news.
Recent weeks have seen several Royal Literary Fund Fellows launching work in new categories. Rosemary Jenkinson's debut novel, The Memorisers, has been published by Arlen House. Imagining World War III, it has been described by Wendy Erskine as offering kick-ass satire, acute imaginative vision and total conviction. Meanwhile, Penny Boxall's first novel for children, Letty and the Mystery of the Golden Thread, has just been released by Puffin. Set in the 18th century, the story follows 12-year-old Lettice Breach in her quest to use her detective skills and nose for art to free her father from prison. In addition, early February saw the launch of Kim Curran's debut adult novel, The Morrigan. Published by Michael Joseph, the book is a witchy retelling of Irish mythology. For more information, visit the publisher's websites. Judith Allnott has been shortlisted for the Edinburgh Flash Fiction Award, run by the Scottish Arts Trust. Allnott's story, War Bride, is one of 22 finalists and will be published in an anthology in November. The winners will be announced during the Flash Bash at the Scottish Arts Club in Edinburgh on Saturday the 22nd of February. Visit scottishartstrust.org for more details. Roy Williams' new play Gatsby in Harlem has aired on BBC Radio 3. Starring Nakuti Gatwa, Gugu Mbatha-Raw and Malachi Kirby, and directed by Celia de Wolfe, the audio drama transplants F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic novel The Great Gatsby to 1920s Harlem. With original theme music composed and performed by jazz company Tomorrow's Warriors, the production is available to hear on BBC iPlayer until the end of February. Piece of Paper Press, the artist's book series founded in 1994 by Royal Literary Fund fellow Tony White, is the subject of a new exhibition. 31 Years of Piece of Paper Press presents a vitrine-based display of all the series titles to date, alongside a wealth of artwork, ephemera and clippings from the project's archive. The exhibition runs at Matt's Gallery in Nine Elms, London, until the 23rd of March. And finally, a revival of a play by a Royal Literary Fund fellow featuring new material by another RLF fellow opens at the National Theatre this month. The new production of the 1979 play Alterations by Michael Abensets, who died in 2016, will include additional material by Trish Cook. Taken from the Black Plays archive, it tells the story of Walker Holt, a tailor whose life unravels over 24 hours as he struggles to fulfil his biggest ever order. The production opens on the 20th of February and runs until the 5th of April. And now back to the studio.
As we come to the end of today's episode, I want to extend a big thank you to Paul Dodgson for sharing his insights with us. It's been such a great conversation, Paul. Thank you so much. We love to hear from you, our listeners. So if you have any comments, writing questions or topics you'd like us to explore with RLF Fellows in future episodes, please reach out on social media using the hashtag RLF Collected. Thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, take care.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLF Collected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.